Great. Okay. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. This session will go over the data that we collect at intake and the WIOA barriers to employment. Okay. With us on this session, we have Brad and Brandy with the Minnesota Department of Education, Ginny with SID, and my name is Rachel Stiglitz, and I work with Metro East Consortium. So what are we going to cover? And oops. No, I'm not. Here we are. I am sharing the screen. Let's see here. It's not forwarding. I'm going to stop the share real quick, and then we'll try again. Okay. Oops. Huh. Okay. I'll start over. So what do we need to know about our, well, I'll go over to session objectives. Okay, start again. So we're going to answer what information is collected at intake and why we're asking for this information, how to explain the WIOA barriers to employment to a student, where to enter this information into SID, and how to update a student's SID account with new information. Okay, so what do we need to know about our students? Well, the information that we collect at intake, and then what's on the data, the intake form provided by SID, and what is required is a name, address, phone number, and email address if they have these, gender, and now a student has the option to decline, ethnicity and race, social security number, and again, option to decline, primary language, birth date and the country of birth, location of their highest grade level completed, employment status, and that's the labor force status, and public assistance. It's always good to, for best practice, to always do a person search when you're adding a new student, okay? If it's a returning student, somebody that you've known in, other program years, still do a person search when you're re-entering them into SID, because they may have been at another program that didn't merge them previously, okay? It is good to get as much accurate data for the students as possible, because it's your program and consortium are providing reports to the state, and the state then provides demographic reports as well as measurable skills gains reports to the federal government. And if data is matching to those students with the MSGs, the measurable skills gains, then those will reflect on things that we may not know as a program have been accomplished. So of course, when a student makes a level gain on a test, like a STEPS test or a CASAS goals test, that we can see, right? If somebody completes all 4 GED tests and pass that, the state will automatically update their student account in the history side of that. But of course, the data has to be as complete as possible to be able to match that, okay? Name, address, name, birth date, social security number, or another identifying factor. And then, as Brad mentioned in our first opening session, there's some MSGs that we don't know about, but the state can run reports on to collect and report to the federal government. And that's stuff like employment after they leave your program, employment at the second quarter, employment at the fourth. And again, if we have their social security number, those are counted and do reflect well on our programs for the state of Minnesota. Okay. A little bit more about the labor force status. In this field, you do have 4 options: employed, unemployed, and if you can get their date of last employment, that would be great, or somewhere around there. If they're a new person to the, looking for jobs, or they're new to the country, maybe when that first date of when they started looking for employment can be applied, okay? Not in labor force means that they might be retired. There could be a homemaker, okay, a stay-at-home mom or dad, so they're not seeking employment. And then employed but to be terminated or separated, meaning maybe the factory they're working on is shutting down, okay? I'm gonna hand the rest over to Brandy, and if you can control the screen, that'd be great. Okay.
Thanks so much. Hey everyone, it's Brandy Logan, and we're going to go into barriers to employment. So if we can go back to slide 7. There we go. So barriers to employment you can find over in WIOA section 324, which it describes the 13 barriers to employment. As you see, cultural barriers, disabled, displaced homemaker, and all of the other descriptives. The ones with the red asterisk have been newly added this new program year. And those changes have been reflected on the SID intake as well. So if you've seen those and had questions when they were added, those were added as of, I believe, July 1. If I'm quoting myself wrong, someone can pop that in the chat. But these are the individual barriers to employment that we are to collect and required to collect. And when we say collect them, we ask individual students to self-identify, but we cannot leave this blank unless the student purposely leaves it blank, if that makes sense. Next slide, please. So all ABE students face this barrier, individuals with low levels of literacy. And then they also have some additional barriers as English language learners or individuals facing substantial cultural barriers. And one example that I like to use for the cultural barriers is one that I learned doing tribal nation information is some students or some individuals of tribal nations will have cultural times where they stay home and they may miss school or they may miss work. And that might be falling under a cultural barrier for students. And of course, ELL is very easily explained. Barriers to employment. These are federally recognized barriers to employment under WIOA. Students are to self-report, as we had mentioned prior, to their status, but programs are required to ask about the 13 barriers at intake. And so we've had conversations, we've heard conversations from the field about this can be really personal information. Sometimes people don't understand the definitions or they don't feel like they fall under a category. And so we're going to take a closer look at those barriers and definitions and how to relay that information to individual students during intake. So cultural barriers, as we mentioned, students perceive themselves as possessing attitudes, beliefs, customs, or practices that influence a way of thinking, acting, or working that may serve as a hindrance to employment. And this could be under any cultural barrier, but we want to understand, we can't understand every culture and what may be an issue for them. So just kind of giving them the opportunity to explain maybe their background or a time where they missed work or a time where they're missing class and trying to connect that understanding of the definition. Disabilities. Individuals with a disability means individuals with a disability as defined in Section 3. This could be any physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more activities. So, of course, any kind of physical disability is a little bit easier to identify, but then you also have mental disabilities. So individuals that feel that they have a disability and they self-reflect that, they are to add that into the area. Displaced homemaker. This one kind of has a lot of questions. And so a displaced homemaker means an individual who's been provided unpaid services to family members in the home. And so you're always thinking about individuals that have been at home taking care of elderly parents or maybe a disabled spouse or child or some type of other family member. And they were taken care of, but not being paid for their services. So they were out of the workforce. We can also talk about dependent spouses of active duty armed forces, and then unemployed or underemployed difficulty as well. And so we've had one question arise, which was really kind of a new way of thinking about a displaced homemaker, was someone that grows up culturally not to work, usually females, and they stay at home with their parents until they go off and get married. and that's a cultural background for their family. But that person did not work until now. They're wanting to work because, again, you have that labor force, which means, are you planning on looking for work or not looking for work? So someone of that category could fall under displaced homemaker as well. Next slide, please. English language learner, a person who has limited ability in speaking, reading, writing, or understanding English language, and or their native language is other than English. And or they live in a family or community environment where the language other than English is that dominant language. And so we see a lot of that with our refugee population as well as our large ESL population. Ex-offender. So ex-offender is a person who meets one of the following categories, either subject to any stage in the criminal justice or requires assistance of overcoming barriers resulting from a record. So a lot of individuals may have records from prior years, possibly even juvenile, and sometimes currently incarcerated. I know that we have a large population there too. So ex-offender is, just think of anyone that's had any interaction with the criminal justice process is usually how we kind of lump sum that in there. Foster care, a person who's currently in foster care or has aged out of the foster care system. I know that, we don't service students until the age of 17 or older. So you may come into interaction with students that are currently in foster care. I know that there are programs for students even after the age of 18 to stay in for assistance and additional resources and or aging out at 18. Homelessness. Homelessness means a person who lacks a fixed, regular, adequate nighttime residence. So I always like to use, sometimes people automatically think homelessness means that someone's living outside under a bridge or in a tent in a wooded area. And that's just not what homelessness is always defined as. It could be someone that has lost their residence due to eviction or due to fire or flooding or any array of situations. And now they do not have a permanent nighttime residence. So it could be a student that's couch crashing is what I like to call it. So they're going from home to home, sleeping on couches, but they're not particularly sleeping in a car or sleeping outside. And so a lot of individuals don't find themselves considered homeless because they're not out on the streets. And so living in a motel, sharing a residence due to economic hardship. So just always a conversation to have if a student reveals that to you. Low levels of literacy, a person who is unable to compute and solve problems or read, write, and speak English at a level necessary to function at the job. And so all of our students do meet this low level of literacy. So if any barrier is to be selected, it is this barrier because all of our ABE students fall under this category. Low income, this is a person receiving or has received assistance in the last 6 months. We're looking at SNAP or TANF, SSI, or other public assistance. Maybe they are homeless, received eligible free or reduced lunch. I know that we in the state offer free lunch to all students, but they are still using information to collect on families that might fall within that. Foster care, of course, and disability income requirements. So disability income kind of like is a little different type of that falls under low income, because if someone is receiving disability income, but they live in a home with 4 other working adults, that automatically does not assume that those other adults' income is collaborated for that person's income. So the moment that they have disability income, they are an income of one only. And so that is through WIOA regulation. Migrant worker, seasonal farm workers. So a student who meets one of the following is a low income individual who for 12 consecutive months out of prior 24 months has been primarily employed in the agriculture, fish farming, faces multiple barriers to economic self-sufficiency, or a seasonal farm worker whose agricultural labor requires travel to a job site and is unable to return to the permanent place of residence within the same day. So that is what's considered a migrant worker. I know this is one of our smaller populations in the state, but we do have some that have identified as this. Single parent. So the student is a single parent, separated, divorced, or widowed. And the individual has primary responsibility for one or more of the dependent children under 18. And this includes pregnant women as well. So anyone that is identifying as a single parent or currently pregnant would fall into this category. Exhausting TANF, Part A. So calculated from public assistance, a lot of people will know if they're exhausting their TANF. So that's usually not a type of category we have to really define because they would know through their case management if they are about to exhaust all options and resources. Long-term unemployed. So this is part of that labor status we talked about. The definition is a student who's been unemployed for 27 or more consecutive weeks. And that's just a basic definition. Possible scenarios. So I want to go over some possible scenarios with everyone. Yes, Christy.
Yeah, can I interrupt you real quick? There is
Yeah.
a question in the chat before we move on.
Okay.
They just asked, say more about Native cultural barriers. Very vague.
Yeah, so it's not just specifically to Native cultural barriers, but that was kind of the definition that I kind of asked about when I was going through the training. Is I had met up with some tribal leaders and they had talked about sometimes they have cultural or religious events that requires them to stay home and reflect and participate. And so if that's the case, they could not go to work or they could not go to school. That could be a cultural barrier to employment. Because what if a employer doesn't agree with it and wants to either not hire them or fire them? And so these could be issues of cultural barriers. Of course, this could fall under any cultural issue. So there's really not a specific definition. It's how the person perceives their interaction with employment and if there is kind of a barrier to that employment based off of a ABC example that they give you. Does that help a little bit more? You can unmute yourself if you want to ask a question. We're not that large of a, well, we are a large group today. Okay. All right. So possible scenarios, I just wanted to kind of throw this out here. You can type the answer. And so we're going to go with students received SSDI. What would that barrier be? Students receiving SSDI. What type of barrier or barriers would that person fall under? You can go ahead and type that in the chat. Ability, wonderful. Low income, yes. Social Security disability, disabled worker. Wonderful. So the common area, the common response is disability, of course, but then also disabled or low income as well. The student recently stayed home and took care of their elderly parents and did not work. What barrier would that fall underneath? Displaced homemaker, yes. All right, and the last one is a student's house burned down and they're living with their aunt. What would that fall under? Homelessness. Thank you so much. You guys did great. Thank you so much. And I'm going to turn it over to our next presenter.
Hi, I think that's me next, right? Okay, we're just going to look at some of the intake screens and where you find, where in SID you're going to be putting in the information just discussed about the various barriers. So we're going to start with a copy of the paper intake form. Now, they've mentioned this at the opening session. We do have an intake form available in paper, and I think some people do download that and maybe change it and adjust it a little bit for their own local programming, which is fine. But I just wanted to remind you where it is. So if you're in SID, any screen in SID, there is across the top are the various headers, and there's one that is the help. And when you click on the help link, you'll go to our help center. And if you click on the student section, the next screen will look like this, and then you click on the intake form link, and that will bring you to a page that has our downloaded intake paper version of the intake form. And Mary also put a link to that in the chat. So if you do want to model your intake form on ours or use it directly, that's where you can find it. And then on that, wait, the previous slide again, the link I did not point to over here, the one below the intake form, is the Create New Student from Scratch. That's, of course, a help article about how you make a brand new student. And in that help article on that link, now you can go to the next page, we also have a definition of all the items on the intake screen. So what is the intake date? What does country of residence mean? Well, that one's obvious. What are the various gender options and what are their definitions? So this is what we call the chart of definitions, and it is found on that link on that previous page also. So I wanted to point that out. And Mary put that link also in the chat. So if you weren't aware of that little handy dandy kind of handout item, that's where that is. Okay. So we're going to just take a quick look at the SID intake screen and where all those barriers are that Brandy was talking through. So of course, if you are, as I think Rachel mentioned in this session or the previous session, when you're making a new student, when a student comes to your program, you always do want to do a quick person search. So we kind of buried the new student button on the person search page to kind of remind you to always do a person search of any student. To make sure that if they already went to programming in another program in the state, you can find them. And that's a whole process that we're not going to go into today because it's kind of long. But if you have a brand new student who's never existed in ABE before or never existed in your program before, then you're not going to make the student, Laura, like I apparently said, but you're going to make a new student record. So you're going to click on this, the new student button here, and then you'll get the next screen. And this you should all be familiar with is the SID intake screen. And, you know, the items that have either a red colored thumb up or down or are red colored themselves are the items that you should be pretty aware of this now. You cannot even make a student record until you've answered those questions. So those are the very basic bare bones of what is required to make a student record in SID. So that's going to be the name, first name, last name, birth date, gender, the racial information, and we'll scroll down in a second. But then the things that don't, like social security number, we really, really highly request that you get that information if you can. Some students don't have a social security number, and that's okay. And some students don't want to share their information for security and safety reasons, and that's understandable too. But as has been mentioned a few times, it's important we get as many of those as possible for our outcome information. So I think I have the next screen has the actual barriers. So the second half, as you scroll down the intake screen, is where you get to the barriers to employment, and those are the ones that Brandy just kind of walked through. Above that box of barriers is the work status question. So this is where you're going to put if they're unemployed or employed or not in the workforce. And if they are unemployed, we ask that you try to find out what date they began their unemployment. And for many people, that's because they either were laid off or whatever, that would be that date. And maybe you can put in a close guess if they have some idea, but might not know the exact date. And then Brandy had a good example of a student who maybe somebody came out of college and now they're looking for work. So that was kind of the date of their unemployment is when they start looking for work. College is probably not the right example here for ABE, but maybe somebody who's a new arrival. So we use that date to try to calculate if people are getting to that definition of 27 weeks of unemployment. And then the question next to that is the public assistance. And if they are on MFIP, you can try to ask if they have any idea when their MFIP does expire. And we have found that actually a lot of people don't know because there's so many variables. If they work for a while and then they can pause their expiration date might stretch out. If they have another child, that might change their expiration date. So I know this is very complicated to get. I know I've heard feedback from programs, and we talked about this years ago, who they'd call job counselors, and job counselors aren't even aware. So just try to do your best to see if then we can see if anybody's near that within that 2 year of expiration. So those are kind of more complicated ones for getting the information accurate, as far as inputting it and us calculating some kind of formula. But then the other barriers are just simple checkoffs. So if you have your paper intake that you've done with the student and they've checked off the items, then obviously you can check those off here. You can check as many that apply. Like I think that one example that Brandy had, the student would be both disability and low income. You can check, like I said, as many as you can that apply. There is a little blue question mark here at the top, and that does bring you to our help page, our SID help page, which has some somewhat simplified definitions of all these items. So if you are curious and you can't remember exactly whether the foster care is current or whatever, you can look at that simplified explanation. So that's where you put it in the intake screen. And then where this information then appears on a student page. So right here, we're looking at the student summary screen for our student. We have a fake student named Fozzie Bear. And after you've done your intake, and you've put all their information and you click save, it's going to bring you to the student summary screen, I'm sorry. This is also a student summary screen of a student who's been around in your program for a long time. If they have some item over here that you want to update or edit, maybe some of their demographic information, or if there was an error or something, you can click edit and you'll get a little window. I don't think I did that, did I?
That was me.
Okay. It's like, wow, I have magic powers. So that's why we've highlighted that little green edit box, if you ever need to edit some of that information. And then I've highlighted over here, but I don't have a screenshot, is the info page, which is where the students like address, phone number, email, that kind of information. If you ever need to update that, you would click the info page, and that's where you could update that. But all the barriers are on the history tab. So why don't you click to the next screen? And so this is a little screenshot of a history tab. And this is where a lot of that information then gets populated when you've done your intake with the student. And I know some programs do, you may feel more comfortable. I heard people discuss this a little bit at the manager's meeting. You may feel more comfortable trying to get some of this barrier to employment information from students, maybe once they've started their first class, or if you have an orientation or something, rather than right at that first intake. You would also need to go here to this history page to input that information. All the information that appears here are things like their work status, their education level, that you ask at intake, all the various barriers to employment. That shows up here on these different lines, and it shows the date that information was effective. And we have goals on this page as well, people's primary goals, their personal goals, if you track that. And then if you're tracking the credentials they've earned. So the history page has a lot of info. And so all this info kind of gets a little cluttered when you've got if a student has a lot of barriers, or they've come and gone and have done intakes a few times with information. But just always know that that's where you go. If you ever need to update something, if a person got a job, you can come and end their unemployment history item and give them an employed history item. The system will still know that unemployment was their status at the intake time. And then if they stick around and next year they're still with you, then the system will know that they're now employed. Okay. Now here's something we want to really start reminding people to use. It's called the re-entry screen. And the reason we want to do this is we know a lot of students kind of stick around for a while, or maybe they leave while they have a job change or a daycare issue, and then they come back a couple weeks later, or maybe a month later. So people kind of come and go. But sometimes they stick around for a long time. And if you aren't regularly updating their information, you might have some of that barrier information might be really old for your students. And we want you to remember to always update your student information at reasonable intervals. So if your student is gone for a couple months and they come back, instead of just plopping that student into class, we ask that you do update all their information. And one of the easiest ways you can do that is if you're looking at the student summary screen. So we're looking at the student named Antonia. Close to the bottom left-hand side is a button called the student re-entry. And what's going to pop up is a screen that looks a lot like the intake screen. And it's going to be pre-populated with their name and address and stuff. So if you do need to update their name, you can click the new name, and you can then type in their new name, if they married or if they changed their name, their new address, new phone, and then it's going to re-ask all the barriers and things. So this is now if the student is employed, you're going to put employed, and then the system will look back and say, okay, they used to be unemployed, now they're employed. So it's going to track historically where the student is at. So it's really important that you do this reentry screen when a student has been gone for a little while. Okay. And then finally, we made an update to the program summary report. So all the reports in SID or most of the reports in SID are on, if you're looking at SID screen, and at the top is the reports tab, and that's where you're going to run a table A, or that's where you have the level gain report. On that report screen is a report called the program summary report. And on the first page, it just gives you a summary of your students. How many are in this age range and that age range? How many are broken down in the racial and ethnic groups? How many are the different ed levels at intake? Well, the second page, we now have put on there the barriers to employment. So it's going to count how many students you have with the barriers that we were just discussing. Okay, now this table is sort of like not interactive, but it's sort of live. So if you don't have anybody with displaced homemaker, that's not even going to show up on this screen. So if you run your program summary report and you're like a small program in particular, this table on the left might only have like a handful of items because if you have no students who were in the foster care system, then that line's not going to show. But this is the new summary page we made listing out those barriers to employment. And then on the same screen is the MFIP and work status. And then I think that's done with my section. So back on to Brandy, right? And maybe I don't know if there's any questions. Yeah. Were there any questions on that section that we should address? I wasn't looking, as sometimes I do.
This is Mary. I think we got them all.
Okay, great.
Yep.
Thanks.
And Cindy had dropped in something about some translations of intake
great.
stuff, and that's what I opened, and I'm like, oh, cool, and I'm like, oops, I'm sharing my screen. So sorry. Okay, thank you, Jenny. I appreciate it.
Rachel,
yeah.
before you get started, we've got about 10 minutes left.
Thank you. Okay. So I do intake specifically for two programs I work with at Metro East. I work at Mounds View, which is a local program up in the northern suburb of the Twin Cities, as well as the Ramsey County Correctional Facility. Okay. So I'm working one-on-one with students or small groups when I do intakes. And how do I explain those barriers to my students? Okay, I have very different clientele in both places, right? So to get to the explanations of those barriers that I believe both Jenny and Brandy referred to is go to the help screen or help tab in SID, and then it goes to the page on the left, click on students, which is highlighted in green, and then it goes to the next page, and then you can see on the right-hand side, highlighted in green, barriers to employment, okay? So those are the WIOA I'm having a hard time forwarding. Oh, here we are. Okay, sorry. It goes to this page once you click on the barriers to employment, and WIOA, which is the Workforce Innovation Opportunities Act. It's a federal act that has been they've come up with these definitions. So these are definitions that are in SID, okay? So what did I do with those? So I print them off and I do explain them to students. And with my students that are English language learners, I take out my phone and, if they know how to read, or I can also do the verbal translation, I can go back and forth with them. Okay, so verbally I use it as well. I took the explanations, printed them off, and I did make them a little bit easier to read. Like they seem pretty tight in there, so I kind of separated some A's and B's, so it's easier for people to read. So there's some abbreviations that people might, I have had people ask me, what is SNAP? Right? So there's, I give the explanation in parentheses, supplemental nutrition program. Okay. So, and then what I did is and then there's also some higher academic language that even some of our native born students might have a little trouble with, like hindrance or perceived. So I used an AI program that's free on the web called Dumb It Down. And just a couple of explanations. I tried to figure out what would be maybe a simpler, even simpler language to provide to the students. So I put that in English, and then I took those translations, and I used Google Translate to translate those in the languages I work with, mostly up here at Mounds View, like Hmong, Spanish, Arabic, and so on. So, and I share them with our students. I've laminated and so on to go over, and I will be sharing those in our presenter file, okay, our participant file with you guys. So you'll have that. So when I am doing an intake, I do take time with the students when they're filling out that form. I ask questions when they're filling out the intake form. When they're writing, especially if they're coming from a different country and they're writing out their date of birth, say it's 9/12/1999, I ask either, in English or using Google Translate, were you born on September 12th or was it December 9th? So just to make sure I'm getting the most accurate information from the student to make sure that that is being entered in the SID correctly. I also am intentional. I'm checking for understanding. That's another reason I printed up the explanations for the barriers to employment and put them in different languages. I go over them verbally or in writing with them, especially if it's a larger group. I might let them choose on their own and then ask them if they have any questions and stuff. And again, checking for understanding. Here's an example. I've had some students mark down single parent. And then I'm like, oh, great. So how many kids do you have? How old are they? And sometimes it's come out, oh, I've had two. They're both over 25. And then I'm like, well, then you don't need to mark single parent anymore. Okay. Because that's only for people that are raising a child that is 18 and younger. Okay. Um, and then, as I mentioned, I am working with students directly, but if you're having somebody fill out that intake form online, is there any follow-up to the barriers? What are you doing to make sure that they understand what these mean? Okay. And then that's it. Again, I'm having trouble moving I don't know. I'm going to stop sharing for a second, maybe. Okay. Oh, here it is. Well, that was the end. I don't know why that got stuck, but I'll share my screen again really quick. And there you go. So that was the end. And like I mentioned, I will have the explanations in the participant file for what I've translated so far. Okay. And you can take them, make a copy. And if you have languages that I haven't used, like say French or something just off the top of my head, you can use Google Translate or another program that you feel comfortable with. So, and any questions? You are more than welcome to put more in the chat. We have about 5 minutes, or you can take yourself off on the mic and, shout out anything that you may have. So everybody's welcome. Great. Or if you'd like to share, I mean, if you're one of the programs that do provide intake forms online, what do you do to follow up, or what kind of plan are you going to make to start doing that? Oh, is Google Translate free? Yes, it is. Yep, just Google Translate. You can save it in your help bar, bookmark it.
I have a
Oh,
I
sorry,
have,
go ahead.
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
So when I was looking at the definitions of low levels of literacy and then the definition of English language learner, uh, both of those definitions seem to be the same. And I asked, so let's say a situation where a student is a professional in her or his home country, like I don't know, a doctor or a mechanical engineer or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
So I was told both of those, but has a low level of English. And then I was told both of those will apply to that student. Would that be right?
That's what it mentioned in the chat, but Brad,
Right.
do you have any additional information to add to that? Or
Well,
Brandy?
I think that answers it well, that both could apply to the individual. I will also note though that if you apply one, those three end up getting bundled. Cultural barriers, English language learner, and low levels of literacy end up getting bundled together when we report to the federal government. So yes, they are very similar, and just the one difference is if someone's an English language learner, that both could apply to them. If their first language is English, then maybe only the low level of literacy would apply to them. And please note that every person that chooses to participate in adult education is an English language learner or has low levels of literacy by definition by participating in our programming, or potentially both.
Oh,
So
okay, that makes sense.
that is also helpful to know. So 100% of our students should have either English language learner or low level of literacy, or both checked.
Okay, thank you.
So
Yeah.
Brad, to that, even with people that test, like they take a CASA Goals and they test an ABE6.
Even if even if they test at ABE6, well then the question is why are they attending adult education classes, and what is the adult education content that they need? So they might test at 6, but they still maybe have some remediation, or better yet, some basic skills that they want to just kind of strengthen or rebuild, or kind of focus on. So by saying that they want to build their basic skills, they are saying that they have low levels of literacy.
Okay. There's a question by Open Door St. Paul. If a lot of my learners don't have English language learner, low literacy level, and cultural barriers applied, is that something I should try and update? Or if so, is there an easy way to do a large number of people at once? Is that something we need to do retroactively or just start now, Brad?
Jenny and Mary, I'd encourage you to kind of chime in here, but I don't think you need to rush and like start going through hundreds of previous student files. I would encourage you to do this from this point forward. Try to be as accurate and careful as possible with this. Jenny, Mary, anything that you'd like to add to that?
No, I would concur with that. If there's some behind the scenes stuff that we do to make sure our students are reported like this to the feds, but so for your program, at the program level, from here on out, be trying to complete this as thoroughly as possible. Yeah. And there is no easy way to go back for you all to do it and just tag everyone. So
Yeah.
I agree with what she said. This is
Great.
Mary.
I love when all three of us agree.
yes, that's nice.
So we're at 10:45, and I think we got through most of the questions. Jason had one. Is there a way to upload the data you collected from a Google intake form into SID? That may be something that Ginny or Mary could respond to.
There is no way
Mhm.
to do that. No, sorry. So we do have an online intake form that you can use, but if you're asking other and additional questions that don't exist on our intake form, then that's probably why you're using some kind of Google Doc rather than ours. Then there's no way to import that. No.
Great. Okay. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for taking the time to spend with us. I hope you learned a lot.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye. Thanks.
Yep. And you can end the recording, Christy.